As we prepare to get started, allow me to address some important logistical information. Please have the PowerPoint you obtained for today's webinar handy. You should be prepared to either view it from your computer or print it out so that you can follow along and refer to it during the call. Today's webinar is being recorded. It will be made available to you and others who could not attend this webinar. For the listening enjoyment of all, we have muted the phones and ask that you continue with your phones muted. Throughout the presentation, we will provide opportunities for you to ask questions. If you have a question before we open the phones, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box on the bottom right of your computer monitor. Once we open the phones for questions, we will unmute the phones so that you may ask questions directly. After that period, we will again mute the phones. For the listening enjoyment of all, we urge you to keep the phones muted until we unmute the phones again. Thank you. I'm Wilbert Francis, the Project Director for Post-Secondary Education at the UCLA Tarjan Center. The Tarjan Center is a federally designated Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities and your host for today's webinar. Support for today's webinar comes from the California Community Colleges Chancellor's Office through a contract that enables us to provide technical assistance and training to community colleges, DSPS, who are working to provide equitable supports, services, and opportunities for students with disabilities, including students with intellectual disabilities. The Tarjan Center provides technical assistance to the colleges per request, and the technical assistance is focused on expanding access and improving practices so that students with intellectual disabilities and autism may attain success in higher education and beyond. There are a number of colleges that are doing great work with these students, and one of our roles is to connect your college with peers that are using best and promising practices. We are excited to bring you today's webinar, Advanced Strategies for Supporting Students with Autism Spectrum Disorder in Higher Education, presented by Dr. Jane Fairfield Brown. Dr. Brown is Director of Disability Support Services at the University of Connecticut School of Law. She's also Assistant Clinical Professor at Yale Child Study, Yale Medical School, and the Director of College Autism Spectrum. She has worked in the disability services field for more than 36 years and holds an EDD from Columbia University Teachers College. Dr. Brown consults with many families, students, school districts, and institutions of higher education. She has appeared on Good Morning America, CBS News, and NPR. She has co-authored a number of books, including Student with Asperger's, a Guide for College Professionals in 2009, The Parent's Guide to College for Students on the Autism Spectrum in 2012, and Behavior Management and Self-Regulation in 2012, along with many textbook chapters and articles. Dr. Brown is married and has 3 children, the youngest being a 24-year-old son with autism. We'd like to thank Dr. Brown for joining us today and sharing the wealth of her knowledge with California community colleges. Thanks also to all of you for joining us for today's webinar. And now, without further ado, here's Dr. Jane Fairfield Brown.
Thank you very much, Will, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with all of you today. I'm really honored to have this chance. I've had the pleasure of looking at a wonderful survey that Will put together, writing questions to all of you about students on the autism spectrum, and I've spent a great deal of time going over that to try and really address a lot of what you responded in that survey today. I do know that many of you are working with a lot of students on the autism spectrum, and I know that you have lots and lots of experience. I know that others of you don't have quite as much and are looking for more information. I'm going to do my best to meet the entire group's needs today by giving you a little bit of both, mostly advanced, but I will give you some general information if you need it. One of the very interesting things from this survey was the numbers of students that many of you are working with on your campuses. 42% of the almost 80 respondents said you had between 0 and 50 students. 22% had between 51 and 100 students, and 18% have between 100 and 200 students. Another 18% of you had over 200 students that you're working with on your campuses or that you suspect have an autism spectrum disorder. That tells me 80% of you are working with somewhere between a handful up to 200 students on the spectrum, which is a tremendous amount of people. How many are receiving services? 50% of you said up to 50 students, and another 30% of you said between 50 and 150 are receiving services. So again, we've been doing this work for 18 years, and we've been saying for 18 years that this population is growing, and when it starts growing, it's going to gain speed quickly in the numbers and the prevalence, and that is now what we're seeing. And you know from the numbers from the CDC that we are only going to continue to increase for the next 10 years. The group we're seeing right now at college is the group that was from the 2006 survey from the CDC that told us that 1 in 100 students, or 1 in 100 people, have autism. We are of the group that they were studying, which was 8 to 12-year-olds. What we're now being told is 1 in 68, but we won't see that group on our campuses for another at least 4 to 6 years, depending on the age, because that was done 2 years ago on 8 to 12-year-olds. So we have a few years to go till we see those numbers. We're going to talk a little bit more about the survey and about accommodations, but let's get going with some strategies. I want to give you the sort of a sense of what I'm doing today, which is I want you to think about this group in terms of education, and as Will said, which is the community college's goal all over the country, open access education and inclusion. I believe that we need to think about this as beyond education. Of course, education for education's sake is all of our goals as educators. However, in this economy and for students on the spectrum especially, we have to think about what the end goal is and if employment is part of that goal. And if we're thinking about employment, we need to think about not only what the student is studying, but how they are studying and how they're functioning on our campus, which would translate to an employment setting. So I want to talk about that just a little bit before we get directly into issues in the classroom. We've done a tremendous amount of research over the past 6 years on our students graduating from both community college and four-year colleges and universities and what the employment outcomes are, both 6 months after graduation, 9 months after graduation, and then a year and 2 years and so forth. But what we find that the issues that are especially unique to college students on the spectrum is the lack of job exposure or experience. We find that today with most of our millennials, but especially our students on the spectrum, even sometimes throughout college, have no job or internship exposure. That academic prep and services and sometimes therapies take great precedence over life and independent living skills, and that often our students who are very symptomatic might not have a lot of motivation for work unless it is surrounding whatever their special interest is. Often the technical skills that our students have far outweigh their ability to communicate, and that's also not commensurate. And that these things all greatly affect employment for our group. So this is from the National Association of Colleges and Employers from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And what this is for typical new graduates, the employers looking at candidates' skills. And number one is the ability to work in a team. And we know that that is an issue for our students on the spectrum. we often have to think about, depending on what we're looking at for the student. When we're thinking about accommodations, if we're looking at a specific area for a student, a specific major, if that major and that outside work is greatly team structured or group structured, is this going to be an appropriate major? We're seeing more and more of that around the country, where students after graduation are challenging their colleges and universities legally, saying, if you knew that I was not going to be able to perform in this area, weren't you just stealing my tuition? Now, I have many thoughts about that, but I feel like you should all know that that is coming down the pike as we work with increasing numbers of students. The abilities to communicate verbally with people inside and outside, decision-making and problem-solving. You can read through that list of 10, many of which are great challenges for our folks on the spectrum, and we need to think about how we can assist students in presenting their skills when we think about employment after graduation. The obstacles being what we know we have to help our students with: mastering job application processes, new routines, communicating, and that social interaction that we often refer to it as intuitive social interaction, that many of us who work in higher ed gravitate to our workplaces because we like the social environment and the multitasking of our everyday work. And that's exactly what may be an obstacle for many of our folks on the spectrum. So we have to think about all of these things. I think I would be remiss not to bring it up, because there are so many challenges right now from students after they graduate and from their families, saying, then why did you let the student proceed with their education? And I'm a big believer in the education for education's sake, but we need to keep this in our mind as we're talking about more strategies for the growing number of folks on the spectrum. So a lot of what we're talking about in college, and of course certainly with employment too, is what we refer to in our older voc rehab words of sustaining effort. And a lot of what is looked at for the ability to get through college courses and the ability to do competitive employment is that sustaining effort skill. It requires the two things that we know our students on the spectrum often struggle with, which is motivation and initiation. Those are the two things in all of our research that continue to come up as issues that we need to develop strategies for students, and we're going to continue to talk about that in our time together today. Motivating students to get through those courses that are not of high interest, and then getting the students to separate from their preferred task to do work that may not be of interest. That initiation and motivation are very difficult, and delaying the gratification of doing the preferred task when your work is done. Those things are all very difficult for all of us all the time. I say especially on I'm here on the East Coast on a Friday afternoon. That's always difficult, or on a Friday morning on the West Coast. But these things are what we're looking at developing in our students. So how do we take all of these thoughts? As I would like you to keep these in mind as we talk through assisting students on the spectrum with college and eventual employment. What we have found in working with thousands of students on the spectrum is that we need to really get to know the student and look for these keys that are identified on this slide to give us insight into the student's ability to, number one, is accepting feedback. Many students struggle with critical feedback, and being able to accept feedback from peers, which is greatly increased in today's college environment, where we do a lot of peer reviewing, not only in writing classes, but sometimes in group work. And getting our students to be accepting of that feedback can be difficult. So I would suggest that we do some practicing with our students. Once we get to know them well enough, that we start giving some critical feedback when we know they're still going to come back and see us again, that they can accept it maybe better from someone who they've developed a rapport than with another new professor, but that we begin to develop those skills in a safe environment, and that we get to the point eventually where a student may be able to identify an issue that's difficult for them once someone has pointed it out repeatedly. Get to that point of learning. That can be really important. I want to talk for a moment about independent problem solving because I'm finding this as an increasing issue with our new college students. Because the fact that most of the students who make it to college that are on the autism spectrum, and right now our most recent research tells us that about half the students with autism are college capable. In other words, their intelligence level is that above someone with an intellectual disability, so that they may be pursuing some college after high school. What we know from a 2011 study from the American Academy of Pediatrics is that approximately 33% of students with autism nationally are doing anything after high school, either working, going to a day program, or pursuing college. 33%. 67% of our students on the spectrum who are graduating from college or getting a certificate of completion at age 21 or in some states 22, 67% are sitting home and not participating in any outside employment, volunteering, or college. And that has to change. With our increasing numbers, that has to change. One of the ways we're trying to change it, and I will talk about this as we go through our slides today, is we have to start earlier. Starting at the age when a student begins college is just too late. Too many attitudes and routines are already formed, and the family and the student are too embedded in those routines to be able to break out of them and change things drastically by the time the student goes to college. Part of that is the only reason students are making it to college is usually someone in their life, most frequently a parent, is a strong advocate for them to get appropriate service from the school district, from the schools, from the clinicians and therapists, so that the student gets to the point where they are able to graduate from high school and attend one of your institutions. Often with that strong advocacy comes many accommodations in the K-12 setting. And what I'm seeing as I observe K-12 districts and their students on the spectrum in our transition research is that many folks absolutely unknowingly are doing all the problem solving behind the scenes. And if, for example, and a very simplistic example, but if I'm a special education or resource teacher and I bump into one of the classroom teachers and say, you know, gee, my student Joe has a test today and he's going to need that extended time, but, you know, we have that assembly in the auditorium, and the clinician says, oh, you know what, let's just tell him to go to the assembly. He can miss that next period class and use this extended time there. And I say, fine, I'll talk to Joe, and they say, fine, I'll talk to the other teacher and let him know he'll be taking his test. What we've done, and sometimes, believe me, I understand our high school professionals have an overwhelming job in everything that they have to do right now between core curriculum and state requirements and the students and parents. But in that short interchange, they have robbed Joe of that learning experience of how do I solve this problem when I have to have extended time for an exam but something else is going on. And now Joe never gets those experiences of how to self-advocate when they realize that there's a problem because somebody else is always doing it for Joe without even realizing it. It's something we all do every day for our students and don't realize it. But we really need to look at how that's happening and how we can get the student to learn way before college. Because otherwise that ends up in the DSPS office, which is not only not the appropriate place, but there's no way you can handle all of those little day-to-day things for every student who crosses your threshold. We need to figure out how the students handle stress and help give them better ways to handle stress so that that overload of stress, which usually ends up in a meltdown or an outburst, does not come out in the classroom. And that we need to figure out what are the stressors and what coping strategies the students have learned so that we can build on those. And that might be a counselor or a therapist outside of the DSPS office. And you can tell I'm very quickly going through this information since we only have 90 minutes. And we are going to have time for questions in a few slides. If you would, because I don't want you to forget your questions, please type your questions into the chat box, especially if we aren't going to be able to get to all the questions, and I will do my very best to get to all the questions that are in that chat box before we end today. So to break down the stress, because that often for folks is really the center of some of the outbursts and meltdowns. And if you're interested in this area, I strongly suggest Carla Fisher's work. Ms. Fisher is a woman on the spectrum who's done some great work of explaining autism burnout. And what she explains is that the neurotypical brain really only processes about 20% of information consciously. A lot of what we're all doing right now is blocking out other information that's coming at us and trying just to focus either on the people you're in the room with or the sound of my voice or the slides or taking notes, or you're doing something to help you concentrate on what's going on rather than all those other things that are bombarding your senses at the moment. And what Carla Fisher explains is that for people with autism, the majority process 100% of the incoming information and stimuli on a conscious level. And so trying to filter out what is and isn't important and what folks are supposed to be concentrating on takes a tremendous amount of work. The nervous system gets overtaxed and very easily can slip into an autism meltdown or autism burnout. And so sometimes those stressors are what push students into that situation. So you really want to know what really stresses a student, what the antecedent is or what precipitates it, and then what does it look like when that particular student is going to have a meltdown? What kind of behaviors do they have? And are there interactions with others? And for the majority of students I'm sure that you see, the majority will get emotional rather than violent. But you do need to make sure that students' interactions with others are going to be, as one person mentioned in the survey, and I just had a student last week with this same situation. They were getting very stressed in a certain lab that had a lot of equipment that could be dangerous. And one of the survey respondents and with the student I was working with, the student was asked to leave the class because the student was having repeated outbursts around this very dangerous equipment. And so we want to know what is going to happen when that student is overstressed and can't function in the environment. What are their calming methods? And of course, we can't talk to the student about specific medications, but if they are on medication, ask them to maybe talk to their doctors about, gee, is the medication working the way they need it in order for them to remain in school? We know that anxiety is deeply rooted in autism, and again, that can be a medication issue that gets referred to the doctor. But what the most important thing is that I see at this time of year, and for any schools that work on a semester basis, right around now or a couple weeks before or in the future, is pre-registration for next year. So that a lot of people are dealing with what will the next semester or the next quarter look like. And often it's that structure and being able to have some routine in their life and that predictability that truly can allow the student to function better. So I would suggest that you really look at those schedules and the availability of courses to assist the student in being able to maintain some structure and routine. For many of our folks on the spectrum, they truly, including my son on this one, They truly understand their world by their schedule. And if you mess up their schedule, they don't understand the world coming at them. So that looking at that structure and routine can increase the predictability of the day. It almost serves as we used to do in elementary school with students on the spectrum by previewing their day and their learning, and then making sure that we review anything they were taught in a class and making sure that we reinforce any new skills. By providing some structure and routine in the higher ed environment, we build that predictability for students so that they may be able to function at their highest level. For a student who's saying, coming to our campus and just taking 1 or 2 classes a week, having that either be on the same days or in a similar time, say Tuesday and Thursday mornings or Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, that will allow us to see the student at their best, as opposed to, gee, one semester it's Tuesday morning and then the next semester it's Wednesday night. Those kinds of things can really be difficult for a student. Sometimes we can't help it. It's when the courses are offered, and I certainly understand that. One of the things that helps tremendously in this area, and we've been able to do this at an increasing number of campuses, is provide a sensory room. And for some campuses that need a more inclusive environment, we call them meditation rooms, and they're truly for anyone. But when we can have them, especially in a disability services office, referring to it as a sensory room and providing the kind of comfortable furniture that we know really helps folks on the spectrum. I know it's more universal design. It really helps all of us. But because we're talking about spectrum today, beanbag chairs help tremendously. Having either a hammock swing or some type of swing, and in one room that we just helped the school put together, they couldn't, because of the structure of their ceiling, they couldn't hang a hammock swing, so they actually got the outdoor kind of hammock and set up just a hammock that can rock, and they're finding even the staff are really enjoying that. Things like lava lamps or a water feature help tremendously. If it's possible, being able to put lights on a dimmer or not needing overhead lights and using soft lighting with lamps can help tremendously. And for some people, either a white noise machine or headphones, that can really help. In a couple of these rooms, we've been able to provide iPads that stay in the room that are fastened to either a wall or a desk, and have some apps that either can play quiet music or where students can play soothing games. Some of them have an app that many of you probably use. I know I use it daily with students. It's called SOSH, S-O-S-H. And that app has a lot of things it was built for students on the autism spectrum, and it helps tremendously. Let me know in questions if you want more info about that app or other apps, and I can give you some more info. But I'll leave it at that about sensory rooms or meditation rooms at this point. I want to talk about meetings for a moment, and when we actually have when we meet with students. I'm finding that having a common visual, instead of sitting across from a student, since we know eye contact and spatial relationships to other people can sometimes be very difficult for our folks on the spectrum. So I would encourage you, instead of where we frequently sit in our offices, which might be across from a student, I would encourage you to instead sit more towards side by side or almost in a V formation where you can have a common visual. I like to use an iPad because then I can write notes for the student that then I can just email to them, or I can also show them things or call up the schedule or call up our student portal and look at a syllabi. Having that kind of visual can improve meetings and communication drastically, because if the student doesn't have to maintain eye contact and use so much of their synapse power to try and either look at you or not look at you, that can really help. Sometimes even looking at a book together can help. I want to just reinforce that making anything you can visual for students on the spectrum. I know most of you know this, but I just want to reinforce it. but making it visual helps, and providing some structure to the meeting also helps. We know by now that students on the spectrum don't enjoy small talk and don't get much out of it. But when the student enters your office, giving them some structure of exactly what's going to happen in the meeting. We're going to talk about your schedule for next semester. Then we're going to talk about what times you're going to get on the computer and register for those classes. Then we're going to talk about the assignments you have to do in the next 2 weeks. And even making that the structure of the meeting visual helps the students tremendously and will make your meetings with the student much easier. I find it's easiest to do with a whiteboard in my office, and I write all those things down. And if we're determining some things within that structure in our meeting, I write those down also on the whiteboard. And then when the student's about to leave, I ask them to take a picture of the whiteboard with their phone. Most have their phone out to do it before I even ask them, because that way it makes it easier for them to remember after they've left the office. Because often, as you know, many of our students, some are very good with email and some are not great with email. So we want to make sure they have multiple ways of getting information. So let's talk about executive functioning as we're talking about. That's really what we're addressing in the previous slide. So we want to teach certain routines that helps to build executive functioning. I think some of our students have come out of high school with some really good lessons in executive function, and I'm finding some students coming to us with no strategies in executive function at all. So it really helps, again, going back to the visual piece, if we demonstrate that executive function in our offices. I am still one of those people who has a line of Post-its around the monitor of my computer, and I move those Post-its in order of priority during the day. And take them off and throw them away as soon as I'm done with a task. And I continue to use that in front of students with autism because I really want them to see that that is my organizational strategy. To the point that some of the students I've been meeting with for a while now, when they'll write a Post-it and put it in the first priority on my monitor, knowing where I look first on my to-do list. But however you organize your office, and I just use my Post-its around the monitor as an example, but however you practice your organization in your office, I encourage you to make it visual and maybe make it almost a narrative and explain it to the students on the spectrum. So much of what we do is nonverbal, and it's so important that we narrate those pieces for students on the spectrum who may not be picking up on the nonverbal cues of us taking notes or writing something down or looking something up, where other students that we work with may very well be picking up on those nonverbal cues. So I think that piece can be very important. Excuse me 1 second. Thank you. A good way to teach executive function, and I've been doing this with students from very young on for a lot of years. We use 3 whiteboards, the smaller ones, they're like 8 by 12 or 9 by 12. They usually come in 3 packs and are pretty easy to buy. And the students need 3 of them. Of course, I hope they would start this way before college, but if they haven't, this is a good time to explain this process to them to help learn executive function. We need 1 in the bedroom that gives things like, that may be a concern when folks are at college, like hygiene, so things like brush your teeth, take a shower, comb your hair. Or whatever things, the students might be, put yesterday's clothes in the laundry, whatever the things may be. 1 whiteboard, no more than 3 things on the whiteboard. 3 in the kitchen that might say, eat breakfast, take your meds, make your lunch, possibly, put your dishes in the dishwasher, whatever it is. And then 1 on the door that they use leaving the house, and that's the reminder one. Bring books for the chemistry test, bring form to hand in to history professor, and bring ballet shoes for ballet class today, whatever it might be. Bring key to the house, possibly. What we like at the beginning is that usually these are the things that verbally mom or dad or someone in the house is telling the student to do, and we're trying to move the student towards executive function independence. So that initially someone might help write these things down, either a parent or someone living in the house, and the student checks them off. What we hope to get to is that the student writes these things down. And we use threes because the brain remembers three things. If you add a fourth, try it at the grocery store. If you add a fourth, you're in trouble. Three things the brain remembers. So that what we want to get the students to is those different things in different parts of the house where they can have those reminders that eventually they will, and for some students it takes a month, for some students it takes a year. But at some point the student will be able to write those things down. When they're on their own, or living in an apartment, even possibly near one of your institutions, then they may be able to keep what I do if someone's in a residence hall is one of those boards goes above their desk and or near the desk, and one goes near the door to their room or apartment, and they write three things on each of those. It might be a shopping list on one, and it might be the work they have to do that night or the next day on the other. But these kinds of executive function skills are really what students need in order to, number one, get through college, and number two, get through life. It's an adult success skill, and this is one of the strategies for how to teach it that we've found to be very, very useful. So, Will, this is our question break. Do we have any questions?
So, yes, we have a couple of questions, and I'm going to unmute the phones right now.
Okay.
All guests have been unmuted.
Okay, great. Now, you mentioned a reference, a source, someone's work. Was the person Carla Fisher?
Carla Fisher. It's K-A-R-L-A. F-I-S-H-E-R.
Got it. Great, thank you for that. And we have a question from, I hope I'm not mispronouncing the name, Dilaram. The question is, how do you teach the child or the young adult to problem solve independently if they haven't done so previously? Do you give up or just let them struggle and figure it out?
I'm going to answer that in two ways. I am a big believer at some point in students struggling and having consequences for behavior, especially. When we're teaching students to wake themselves up in the morning, it's crucial, and it's very hard on the whole family to back off and let the student have consequences for their behavior, which can mean difficulty for the entire family, not only behaviorally, but time and schedule-wise. If a student needs to learn to wake themselves up in the morning and they don't respond to alarms or anything else, we have to let them miss the school bus or miss their ride and have to figure out how to get to school or miss school, possibly get a detention or a Saturday detention or whatever the consequence may be, which is difficult for the whole family. Schedule-wise, somebody might get to work late, somebody might have to drive a half hour out of their way. We have to do it because it's so essential for the student to get to the point of being able to learn all this. When it comes to learning problem solving, Will, can I skip ahead to some slides because I think this would be a good time to show it. Can I do that?
Sure. And Dilaram, if I did not appropriately state your question, please feel free to jump in. The phones are unmuted, and so please, if you would, we are getting some feedback of things moving around on a table or desk. If you could, please recognize that we're recording the call.
The slide that you see in front of you, we frequently use to teach problem solving, because the students really are not seeing the bigger picture. You know, often our students on the spectrum are very detail-oriented, which is fabulous, but the ability to see the larger picture can often get lost. So that what we need to do with students is really sit down and look at what the situation or the issue is, and the issue is not always the problem. And then looking at, as you see, step 2, determining some solutions for the problem. Figuring out who can help or who your resources are, which is a really important skill that we need all students to learn. And then what skills do they need to learn or use? I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time. Is there a lot of noise on the other?
Yeah, there is.
Okay.
I may go back to muting the calls because, you know, I know that we are working with individuals that run busy offices.
Yes, I know.
Inevitably, we have that. So I think I will go back to, is there anyone that has a question that would like to do so audibly now? Or you could continue to type your questions in the chat box, and I'll make sure that they're addressed.
Okay, I think there's one more question, Will, about groups.
Yes.
Can I go to that?
Let me mute the calls, and then you can do the question. Thank you.
Okay.
All guests have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6.
So, Dr. Brown, if you'd hit *6, thanks.
Okay, can you hear me, Will?
Yeah, you're great. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Okay. So there was a question about strategies to assist a student with autism working in a group in a college class. I have a student who is quite resistant to the idea of working in a group. It is required for the student's class. Absolutely, and I think a lot of, it used to be that we would attempt to take students who had trouble with group work and give them a chance to work by themselves, and less, that's frequently not the appropriate accommodation for class, because as this person says, it's required for the student's class. And we know that in many classes now group work is required, and in much of the world group work is required. So just allowing the student to work by themselves is often not an appropriate accommodation. I think there's a few things that we can do. Number one, if the student is truly having difficulty, and if the student has had difficulty behaviors in the class, we certainly want to talk to the rest of the class. And doing that in such a way that is not offensive to the student, but is really talking about diversity, that many students in the class have different learning styles, and not everyone is going to want to work with everyone in the class. However, there is no job in this world where everybody you work with is exactly the person that you would dream of ever working with, that we all have to work with people who have different work styles than we do, and that it's an important skill to learn. Because possibly for the student on the spectrum, they might have people that they don't want to work with. So that can be very important to have that conversation with the entire class. Then I think what really helps, and what I usually encourage faculty to do, often if faculty are doing okay, get yourself into groups of 4, that's a real problem for the folks on the spectrum who frequently get left out. And so we ask faculty instead to assign the groups, either do it alphabetically or have everybody, pull a piece of paper from a bag, and everybody with blue is in this group, or everybody with yellow, or they pull numbers, or however they choose to do it. Most faculty just do it randomly by name and put up a PowerPoint slide with who's in which group. But if the professor can assign the groups, that makes it a lot easier for the students. And then when appropriate, we ask the faculty to identify what people in each of the groups would do. Say there's 4 parts to the assignment. One person would do the research, one person would do the presentation, one person might design the PowerPoint, and so on. Many faculty tell us that that's part of the group process, is figuring out how you're going to do the assignment and then what to do, and that's fine. Then it's impossible to assign the tasks. But breaking down some of those things can help tremendously for our folks on the spectrum, because we have to remember how social the group nature usually is. I mean, many students enjoy working in groups because it is more social, because you get to chat. Sometimes you even work outside of the college, and all of that can be really uncomfortable for our folks. So what we ask faculty to do is to give as much structure as possible to any real open-ended or unstructured group work. If it's a more specific group question, if you can give me the specifics, the question was from D. Williams. If you can give me the specifics, I'm more than happy to answer in the later part of the webinar. So I'll go on to, are there other questions that I don't see, Will, or should I go on?
D. Williams is beginning to type, so maybe
okay.
Okay, so she said she appreciated your answers. She said they were excellent.
Very good. Okay.
You can proceed. If there are any additional questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box, and I will be texting Dr. Brown so that we could facilitate asking your questions at a time when it seems most appropriate. Thanks.
Thank you. So let's talk about some classroom strategies. I'm finding increasingly that the typical classroom chair can make a big difference for our students and their ability to focus. So I would encourage you to try some different things in two different ways. The least expensive option is a small disc that is frequently used for people with bad backs. It's also used for quilters, which sounds kind of funny, I'm sorry. But it's called, it's usually marketed as something called an iFit, I-F-I-T. And it's a small inflatable disc that has a texture to it that you throw on a chair. It's small so that it's easily either carried around or thrown in a backpack. And because so many people with bad backs use them, it doesn't look really, it's not something that stands out in a classroom. If you put it on the chair, it acts the same way as the more expensive option, which is a exercise ball in the frame. What we find is that the same as with students with ADHD, if your core is engaged in balancing on this small disc, it's small muscle movement that is balancing, but it's telling your brain to focus, as opposed to the way most of us are probably sitting right now, which is just sitting on something hard like a chair or a softer chair and leaning back, which is telling our brain to relax and just take in the environment. Those different types of chairs, or even a chair with some type of texture on the seat, can make a big difference for our folks on the spectrum. We're doing a lot of research on this in art studios with students on the, we're doing a whole 3-year research project on the arts in college and students with autism. And we're finding that the studio environment is so challenging for so many of our talented artists on the spectrum, and we're trying to find some better ways. So we're enlisting a lot of these kinds of strategies on chairs to see if we can get some better outcomes. So I'll certainly report back to Will if we're finding some other good things for sitting. Any kind of fidgets we know help lots of people, especially those on the spectrum, and there are some really good ones out there. I like one called the Tangle, which is little and just fits in your hand. We like encouraging students to use any kind of sensory objects under the desk. There's also some very good small hand massagers that you can get even in any of the natural food stores. And some of them are used for the back, but many of them are small and fit in your palm and can really help increase attention. For many of our folks on the spectrum, it's also routine. If I have the hand massager in my hand, I'm listening in class, or I'm using the hand massager on my thigh with my left hand, and I'm taking notes with my right hand, or something like that. For sensory objects under the desk, there's several things that students seem to respond to well. Some of the there's the lap desks that are sand-filled, and there's some animals, like stuffed animals, that are sand-filled that people can just have in their backpack and throw on their lap under a desk. That can help. Sometimes it's the whole concept that OTs have taught us about weighted objects, helping people to have more control of their vestibular motion in body and space, so that many of us have put heavy books in backpacks to help students, and for some of those students while sitting, that weight helps. Other things that help are, for some students, it's small squares of carpeting that also are very unobtrusive that people may not notice, that just something like either AstroTurf or something with a carpet with a texture in a small square that you can throw under the desk, and students can just slip off their flip-flops or other easily, maybe not sneakers, that looks pretty different when you walk into class and people are taking their sneakers off. But if they're wearing something like Crocs or flip-flops, they can just take their shoes off. And if they're rubbing their feet or just leaving their feet on something with lots of texture, that can send some real helpful messages to the brain to help focus and to allow them to sit longer. So some of that can really help behaviors in the classroom, like if people are interrupting a lot. And also visual prompts. If you have students who are interrupting or speaking out too frequently in class, any visual prompts can help. Probably 15 years ago, we wrote about the two-card system. You may be using that, and for other people, it's visual objects. I have one student who wears those rubber-banded bracelets on his left hand, and many people wear those, not just college students, so they don't look terribly different. And every time he asks a question, he takes one off. And if he has no rubber bands or rubber bracelets on his wrist, he can't ask any more questions. It took some time to develop that strategy, but it's worked for him very well. And it's a visual reminder that he can't talk anymore in class. He had a very difficult time and was interrupting a lot and had to leave several classes because he couldn't stop talking. But he's now gotten to the point where he knows, I can talk twice, and both times cannot be for more than a minute. And by doing those kinds of things, it helps with the interruptions. So we've talked a little bit about groups. Some support groups, I wanted to talk about not just academic work groups, but support groups. Sometimes support groups can help tremendously for students. Some students really don't like them and want no part of it. Some folks can really learn skills in that group. We've found that delivering services through that group really needs to be done, or it can be done much more effectively if you have a credit for the class. Many students just will not keep coming and getting those services unless there's a credit and work associated with the class. Sometimes the group is much better if it's based on a topic, either a topic of interest or a topic of the day, or for some places it's just learning to be a college student, those kinds of things. But some of the groups do work well, and it depends on the facilitator, and it often works better if the students as a whole can determine the direction of the group. Do they want to talk about social things? Do they want to talk about how to make friends and really learn those skills? Do they want to talk about how to be a college student? If the students have more control, we tend to get much better attendance, and I think that helps a lot. I was just at a university last week that they had upper-class students who were had been in academic trouble and had gotten themselves out of academic trouble. They were running the group for some students who were in academic trouble. And there were students with autism in that group, and one of the students running the group was a student with autism. And they said that helped tremendously. Having those peer models, even though peers are often difficult for our students, the peer models, especially if they're a little bit further along in college, can be very helpful for these purposes. So a lot of what we do in all of this is developing strips. So our students, for the most part with autism, are excellent at scripting. They often will, under stress, go back to scripts from either books or usually from movies or videos. And even we're used to it from our students who may be a little bit lower on the spectrum, or I prefer the term more symptomatic. For our students who are less symptomatic, they too, under stress, seem to go frequently back to scripting. So we need to develop scripts for how to be a good advocate, and we teach and memorize those scripts. We might help the student, in our offices, we might help the student write those scripts, but I've just listed here some of the things that might be useful, like negotiating strategies or how to ask someone out on a date. That's usually not the kind of thing we would do in our offices, and it may be more appropriate if you have a social group or some type of group or some counseling on your campus. But if you don't, or you know that the student is only coming to see you, I would rather venture into having this interaction and maybe writing a script rather than seeing the student develop some stalking behaviors and get picked up for stalking or breaking conduct codes for stalking. Maybe some scripts for how to join a club and what kinds of things you say the first time you're at a club from the campus. I mean, like a student group, not a drinking bar type club. Those kinds of things for developing scripts are very helpful, and I think the more we can do it, the more comfortable we might become with it, because anything can be scripted. And what we know is that so many of our students are in theater or performing arts majors because they'll tell us, if you give me a script, I'm good. If you tell me where to stand and what to say, I'm good. It's when you take that script away that I have a problem. So sometimes scripting can really help. Sometimes I find that those scripts can help behavior management in all of these areas. And I left residence halls in because I know that all of you from community colleges do not have residence halls. I actually left it in because I know several states are starting to develop residence halls with their community colleges, so I wanted to make sure. I wasn't sure if that was happening in California, but I know a lot of your students do live independently or are starting to live independently or with some mild supports in independent living while they're in college. So a lot of that may be appropriate, but we can script things for how to manage behavior if someone's starting to get stressed and what they might say not only to themselves, but what they might say to other people when they start getting stressed and why they might be behaving differently, or what they might say when they rejoin a group after they've had some behaviors. And that also can all be scripted. So I've already mentioned the dating and stalking because so much of this is understanding social cues. And since our students struggle in that area and we don't want to not only have them have problems with our own conduct boards on our campuses, but with the police outside our campus or on our campuses. And so we really want them to understand or maybe have a few of these scripts. And it may not be in the DSPS office. It may be in a counseling office. It may be with a therapist off campus. But we certainly want to make that suggestion so that students can effectively negotiate this very important piece of later adolescence and young adulthood as part of college and part of independent living. So self-advocacy is so important in all of our areas. We need to think about not only how self-advocacy is taught in general, but how to teach it to these individual students. For our students on the spectrum, often there's some lack of self-awareness, so that helping and always narrating for the student some of those things that we're picking up about the nature of this individual student, so that we can reinforce with the student who they are and what they need to realize about themselves. Of course, this can only happen once you've developed a relationship with the student and that there's some trust involved. But often learning self-advocacy, it takes many steps. And of course, we hope that this has already been developed before the student comes to college, but we all know that that's not necessarily the case. So that what we sometimes need to do is really take it step by step with the student on the spectrum, saying things like, well, you were upset that the professor didn't give you enough extra time for your test? Yes, he was supposed to give me a half an hour, and he gave me 10 minutes, and what did you say to the professor? Nothing. I just threw the exam down on the desk, and I walked out in a huff. Well, what could you have said? Well, I could have said, you didn't give me my time. Well, what would a better way of saying it be? And again, making it visual, and then maybe role-playing it with the student. You know, what would you have liked to happen if you had the opportunity again? And then maybe suggesting to the student, can you go back to the professor and apologize for your behavior when you walked out of the exam, and that tell him or her that you were really expecting an additional 20 minutes and that you were upset. And most likely the professor is going to say, but if you didn't say that to me, how would I know? And hopefully then the student will get the idea that they must self-advocate, that no one, I frequently use the term with students on the autism spectrum, that I'm not a mind reader, and if you expect me to read your mind, we're not going to get done what we need to. I think that it's frequent that the students will respond to that kind of thing. They don't always necessarily carry it out in the classroom, but over time it may happen. Again, these are the kinds of things that our other students, not our neurotypical students, often pick up from watching other students. They may not have been taught how to do this, but when they see someone go up and ask the professor a question, they see someone go up and ask for something in class, they start learning that, oh, that's possible and I could do that. That's the piece that our students on the spectrum are missing, and so we have to actually teach it. There's been a question about resources and tools for script writing. I'm going to hold that just till the end, if that's okay, just so I can get through the rest of these slides quickly. So I've shown you this, which is the form that we use, and I keep blank ones of these on my desk. I filled this in to give you an example, but you can use this kind of format in any way you want. You might do one that only has 2 or 3 steps. This has worked for me over time, but this, I hope, will be useful to you just to assist students in developing some structure. I want to talk for a few minutes about a schedule, a rating scale, I'm sorry, not a schedule. And we use this all the time. This comes from Carrie Dunn-Burron's work, and I'll give you that name again at the end. But Carrie developed some wonderful work, having done research with both Simon Baron-Cohen and Tony Attwood, who are the 2 foremost research on Asperger's in the world. Simon Baron-Cohen is from the UK. He's a professor there, and Tony Attwood is a professor in Australia. And what she did working with both of them was, over time, realized that many students with autism were systematizers, where many neurotypicals could be systematizers or empathizers. So that what she found is that by putting a system to any kinds of problems or emotion, it helps students to figure things out. So what she did is come up with something mostly for children called the Incredible 5-Point Scale. And you can Google that. There's apps, there's a website, it's wonderful work, but it's more for elementary. And when I found the 5-point scale, I started adapting it for adults and for my college students and put it on business cards and made scales to help us. And when I met Carrie Dunn-Burron, I mentioned to her how I was adapting some of her work, and she was very interested, and we ended up writing a book together. But what we do is use 1 to 5 more as a communication with students, where for social behavior, 1 would be very informal, just maybe with your family. 2 is reasonable, like you might have when you're outside the house. By 3, you're getting to sort of odd behavior. 4 might be scary, and 5 is more hurtful or threatening. This is just for social behavior, but just in general, what I tell students is if you're walking into a class, you need to be around a 2 or a 3. If you're above a 3 or if you're getting to a 4, you've got to get to one of your safe people, because we don't want you to get to a 5 because somebody might call the police or might have you escorted from the class. And it's just a way to talk that is much more concrete for some of our very literal thinkers, and it gives us a way to communicate. We give the specifics, and then we break it down into 5 concrete parts. So what is the rating with the numbers? What's the likely outcome? And then what was the behavior in the middle? I'm giving an example here of some dorm behavior, which is on this next slide. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but you have it. Again, I know that most of you don't have residence halls. This was a really good example, and I think it just gives you the kind of thing you can do with this slide. This was about a student who was insisting on walking from his room to the common restroom on the hall to take a shower, and he would only walk naked. And he wasn't understanding why he had to wear clothes, because at home he doesn't wear clothes walking from his bedroom to the shower, which made sense to him. Made sense to us too, but we also kept saying that this is a community environment. You can't do that. So this is the scale that we made for that student, and I thought it was just a good example. So though I know it's residence life, I think it gives you a good example. I kept this in as some scales that you might want to think about if people are working with people starting to live independently and living with roommates, and that some of these things that they might want to discuss with roommates. I started to translate this also into group work, which you easily can do, possible group issues for academics. You know, the other students don't want to work on the same topic. The other students are leaving me out of the meetings. The other students are making me do all the work, and then create a scale in how you might deal with that and where you get on that rating scale, where you're going to need to call in some resources or some help. So again, these were just examples, and I'm using roommates, but you can really fill it in with anything. Here, the number 1 is no worries. This one I did on the group, and I'm sorry, I just got distracted because I realized I didn't change the word in 5 to move out. I will ask to be moved out of the group is what I was going for. But number 1, I have no worries. Number 2, this bothers me, but I can overlook it. Number 3, this is really irritating. I need to talk to the other group members. Number 4, this is very upsetting, and there's a serious meeting needed with my group. And number 5, this is a deal breaker. I will be asked to move out to another group. These kinds of things really help in the ability to communicate with your students who might just take either everything from, nothing to an emergency, or they might let everything go as if it's not really a problem. And we find this 1 to 5 scale really. I have some students who walk in and will say to me, I'm at a 3, I really got to talk to you. And we then just close the door and start talking. But I have that same student, if my door is closed and I'm meeting with somebody, might knock on the door and say, I'm at a 5, can you help me? And I'll just say to the student I'm with, can you excuse us for 1 minute? I'll be right back to you. And that's our means of communication, that this student is having a legitimate emergency and he has to meet with someone right away. It really is important with students to be very clear and direct. The way we usually say that our mantra of working with students on the spectrum is say what you mean and mean what you say. We often have to write things down to reinforce them, or do the kinds of things like we've talked about with the whiteboard and or other means of visuals. You really do, though, want to reduce distractions in your office and with yourself. Students will notice if you're distracted by something and not tuned into what's going on with the student will notice, though they're not good on nonverbals, that kind of thing folks pick up on. If your students won't talk, it could be that there's just that delayed processing, and it's going to take a few minutes for them to process and to formulate a response. But it also could be confusion and distraction. So sometimes we need to look at the environment. For many students getting out of the office, sometimes these are the students that you want to take a walk around campus, and that walking side by side, you can often get a lot more information than sitting and looking at each other, as we talked about. Just a moment talking about parents, because often parents are so much a part of the students who are coming to our colleges and universities, the students on the spectrum. But we really need to reinforce with the parents that this is that next step in education and in independence, and that we really need to ease them out, that they should not be picking courses for the students. They should not be waiting for the student outside of class, that if we want the student to have any opportunity to make some relationships, that if they're the student whose mom comes with them to campus, that they're not going to have that opportunity, and that, or mom or dad. Sometimes if we bring them in a little bit, we can help to ease them out. They really need to understand that all of you get autism, and I think you all do from all the responses on the survey that Will shared with me. So that sometimes if they really get to the point where they see that you really get this stuff, that you will understand their kid, then if we can sometimes develop a structure and routine with the parents, you know, if we say, if there's an emergency, I will let you know. But besides that, we have to let him develop some of these skills, or we have to let her try this and see if it works for her. We really, the parents with these students, and I say this as a parent of a very severe son with autism, often the parents really need that structure and need that encouragement that if it's not working, we'll let you know, but in the meantime, you have to let him or her try. Often it's you saying that really encourages the student to go to that next step. We do, as all of you know, need to gather lots of information, and sometimes more than we need from other students, about a sensory profile or how the student manages stress. And as much as we can get from previous teachers or clinicians about cognitive style, so that accommodations can be appropriate. And, you know, we really have to work with the student about that trust and motivation. Okay. My publisher likes me to show you my book, so I am. This is the 5-point book I was mentioning. And I will just leave this slide up so that we can do a lot of questions, hopefully, because we still have 15 minutes. And the website that I have up is our website, but you can contact me through there, either at jane@collegeautismspectrum.com or info@collegeautismspectrum.com also goes to me, so that if you have questions afterwards, I'm happy to answer them, so that if we don't get to your question during our time today, please make sure and email. So go ahead, Will. I'm happy to answer whatever questions we have.
Great. So the first one is there a comprehensive list of items or furniture that you could supply to the group?
Ooh, that's the fun part. I can try. I can certainly get you one, Will, of all the things that we use. We're trying all different types of things. I can't tell you that all of them are thoroughly researched, but I can tell you I've tried and ordered. I'm big on Amazon, and I try and order just about everything that we see and try it with a group of students. So I can't guarantee everything will work, but I can certainly give you ideas, of course. Happy to.
So just to clarify, so you will send something to me and then I will
send
it on to this group? Great.
Yes, I will send it to you.
And
it'll give me a couple days to pull it together. Sure.
You are already being thanked by someone. Okay. So the next question.
Anytime.
The next question is: can you share some resources or tools for script writing?
Yes. Let's see. I believe Jed Baker has some good things out. J-E-D Baker, B-A-K-E-R. I think he has some good things out on scripts. Who else? Let's see. There isn't. I don't think there's anything really good on college student scripts. Or adults. There's some on independent living. Otherwise, most of them, Carol Gray does a lot on the social story, and those are all. That's really done in elementary and middle school. Most of the work that we've done, I've translated from people who have done work on elementary and middle school, and I've translated to higher ed. So I don't know that there's a lot, but if I find, I would think that Michelle Garcia Winner may have some things. She does a lot of You may know some of her work on social thinking, and she has some things possibly. I don't know if they do a lot of good scripting, but you could look at some of her things. And again, I will look into a couple of her books and give Will the resources if I think that they're good. Otherwise, I'll come up with something else.
And then if I might, thank you. If you could take a look at the chat box, there's a question from Katie Orlowski.
Okay, hold on.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Share some tools, resources for stalking. I have a student who now has a reputation for following girls on campus. He becomes very upset if any of his staff or family try to address it. He has had girls become scared and push him away. He wants to be accepted, but he doesn't know how to approach people or how to tell if they're not.
And I trust you saw that he wants to be accepted by his peers and he wants a girlfriend.
Yes.
I just want to make sure you didn't miss that piece.
Yeah, I think I missed that part. Okay. And that is the typical scenario. I think it's essential to address because outside of our campuses, he'll be arrested immediately. Our folks on the spectrum get picked up for stalking all the time. And so it's essential to teach this, and if he doesn't want to address it, I think the best way is, well, we have a stalking scale in that last book that I showed you, the Social Behavior and Self-Management, because it's such an issue. So I think that's important. The same author, Carrie Dunn Buron, B-U-R-O-N, has a great book that we use with high school students, but I think it sounds like the social level this young man is at, this would be appropriate. It's called A 5 is Against the Law. And it very specifically explains that if you get to a 5, like a stalking 5, you will be arrested. And I think that that would be a helpful resource for this young man. He needs to know that what we usually say is 3 times. If you ask someone out 3 times and they say no, and you can ask different things. You know, do you want to go to a movie? No. Do you want to go for a cup of coffee? No. Do you want to go to lunch? No. 3 times, that's it. You have to stop. You have to stop, and you cannot go back and keep asking. I won't take our time with we all have a lot of horror stories about our young men and women in these kinds of stalking situations. But even if he doesn't want to address it, that's when I take all the judgment and emotion out of my voice, and I just say, I know you don't want to address this. It needs to be addressed, and sometimes we have to address things that we're uncomfortable with. But you're going to end up in jail. This is one that I'm especially strict with students about because I don't want our students to end up in jail. We have way too many folks on the spectrum that are incarcerated. They have no idea what they've done. And I don't want that to happen to this young man. So this is an issue especially that I'm really hardcore with because I want students to have every opportunity that they can to stop the behavior because they will get arrested for it, if not on our own campuses. Because the woman that you're talking about now could file charges, even on your own campus, of course, just with your campus police or with the town police. And so it's essential that everybody, the family, the campus, if there's counselors involved, everybody has to be very consistent in addressing it, that no, you may not follow this person, you may not ask them out anymore. And then finding some appropriate social outlets is also key. And I know he wants a girlfriend, so many of our young folks really want a relationship of some type and don't know how to go about it. But I often find that those are also the same folks that won't go to a social group that's designed for young adults with autism, won't go to, the Friday night dinner group that's for folks with autism. They really don't want to meet folks with autism. They want a neurotypical girlfriend or boyfriend. And sometimes, for some folks, the best opportunity for them to have really great social interaction is possibly with other folks that have any kind of disability, that maybe have a similar understanding to them. Sometimes neurotypical folks are really the perfect match. So I think they have to have that opportunity and have more opportunity for good social and appropriate social interaction.
Forgive me for this one if you feel that you've addressed this, but I just don't want to miss it if we haven't covered it appropriately. So this one has to do with scripts, and the question is, do you have examples of actual scripts that you have used that you're able to share with the group?
Oh, sure. Let's say talking to a professor. I will say to a student, could you say to the professor, rather than throwing your exam and saying, and walking out and getting all upset with me and with your family that you didn't have enough time, could you say to the professor, I know you may have to go somewhere, but I needed 30 minutes for this exam, 30 extra minutes for this exam. Can I go somewhere for 20 minutes and finish my exam? And then I'll say to the student, could you say something like that? And if the student says to me, that doesn't sound like me, that's not how I talk, oh, well, how would you say it? And the student might say, you were supposed to give me 20 more minutes than this, and you were supposed to, and I can't do well on this exam without, and I'll say, okay, well, can you use those similar kinds of words, but not sound like you're yelling at the professor or accusing them of anything? And I'll sort of move them towards a more conversational tone. And I'll say to them, if you talk to me in that way, I wouldn't want to give you more time. I would just be upset that you're mad when you're taking your test. And so then hopefully we get the student to, well, maybe I could say, I need 20 more minutes, and I was supposed to get an additional half an hour. And hopefully we get to that point. We rehearse that with the scripting so that the student, and then we say it a lot. I do the same thing when students are at the point where they're about to start looking for internships or jobs, and we rehearse depending on the student, either a 30-second or a 60-second commercial, we call it. And I'll ask the students to give me that whenever I see them on campus. I'll be passing them in the cafeteria, and I'll stop at the table and say, oh, you're done eating. Give me your 60-second commercial, so that they get to the point where they're so comfortable with it that it becomes a script for them. Because most of our students who walk into an interview, the classic first question is, so tell me about yourself. And that's way too open-ended for our students, so that they need a pat scripted answer for what to say. And so it's the same thing. When you get into this kind of situation with a professor, what do you say? When you walk into an interview and you get the tell me about yourself, what do you say? When you want to talk to a girl, what do you say? And so we develop these kinds of scripted things that you can go to when you don't know what to say. That's really what we're developing.
Thank you so much. So let's see, we have a few more. Okay. From Diane, what are some strategies that you have succeeded with to help students with adult-level reading comprehension and self-reflection or analysis essays?
Oh, good question, Diane. As we know, self-reflection and analysis is really tough for folks on the spectrum. For many of those folks, I'll do the best we can first I usually get them off the computer, get them off the keyboard. I find that if students are going to talk about themselves at all or write about themselves at all, they can talk much better than they can write. So first we go to voice input because that helps, and getting away from the screen. And then I will literally put the voice input on, usually with a Bluetooth, and get them away from the computer and have a conversation that they can then go back and edit. What do you need to write about yourself and what you think of, I'm just making something up, what you think of the political situation in our country right now. Let's see, what do you think of the candidates running for president in 2016? And let them, go off about some of the candidates. And what do you think about the Senate races that are going on in our state right now? And let them talk about that. And it's much easier then to go back and look at what's written and edit it to make it look like writing rather than to just come up with things and write them. When you're doing that kind of self-reflection, you know, I'm the type of person who really doesn't believe in doing a job that you don't feel strongly about. I need to be passionate about the kind of work that I do. Those kinds of things might be easier to say than write, so we go to voice input. There's a book that is helpful. It was written by Lisa Meeks, M-E-E-K-S, and Elise Geither, G-E-I-T-H-E-R. The title is long, but it's Helping Students with Autism Spectrum Disorder Express Their Thoughts and Knowledge in Writing. So it pretty much addresses your whole question, Diane, in the title. But that book does help, and it helps people learn some strategies for how to get this information from students. I usually do it by, I think the best word I can use is by interview, making some notes, and if the student is uncomfortable with voice input, I usually just go right to the whiteboard and help the student create an outline through interview, because sometimes the student doesn't necessarily recognize that some of the things they talk about are actually self-awareness. And sometimes the students do lack self-awareness, in which case we go one of two ways. We either ask the professor to do a similar but alternate assignment, which is rare, or we tell the student, the old standby if you have to, go for the C. You know, we just want to get the student through the course. As long as it's not a major, it's not what they're majoring in, we really just want to get the student through the course. So just whatever they can do to get through the assignments.
Thank you. The next question, perhaps it's best if you read this one, and this one is from Rachel Stewart. It's at the bottom of the chat box.
Okay. I have a student who perseverates on terrorism, guns, ghosts, etc. It makes a lot of other students and faculty nervous. And campus sheriffs, sorry, I'm having trouble seeing the rest, Will. Campus sheriffs have
gotten involved. He seems to understand why this is inappropriate in the classroom, but he continues to talk about these things and mutter about them under his breath. How can we support him in stopping this behavior?
Okay. I think the first thing, and I'll try and be brief about this, but this goes to our conduct codes. Our conduct codes in this country are all very negative, which I disagree with. It tells you everything you cannot do. It doesn't tell you how you're supposed to act. But I think for our folks on the spectrum, taking those massive, boring conduct codes and putting them onto a one-sheet bullet point document so that students understand what is not allowed, what is absolutely, I put it in terms of against the law on our campus. I think that's what this student needs, that he needs to have very specific rules about what he can't talk about, that you may not talk about guns, you may not talk about terrorism. It's against the law on our campus. And if you're heard talking or muttering about that in class, you will be asked to leave class. I think that has to be black and white because he will get to the point of writing assignments about terrorism and guns, and that usually will get the student in front of an academic misconduct board and often get them to be asked to leave class or to leave your campus, and you don't want the student to get to that point. Giving the student very specific rules and, of course, making sure that they have a counselor or therapist dealing with this. At some points, especially if faculty or students are complaining, it becomes a disruption of the educational environment, which is in every conduct code in the country. And if the student is disrupting the educational environment, they have to be moved out of the class because the other students and the professor then the other students can't take advantage of the learning, and the professor can't teach appropriately, and that's a problem. So I think that sometimes these cases get much more severe than what we think they are, but actually students may be complaining to other students may be complaining to their department head, so that we have to deal with it right away to extinguish those kinds of behaviors in school and give them another outlet. But that usually has to involve family or a counselor in addition. It's a tough question. I'm happy to talk about the specific student more after the webinar on another day if you need. I'm happy to help you with that.
Sure. So I'm not sure if you could see her response. She says she agrees with these points. Thank you, Dr. Brown. That would be wonderful. So, okay, I see Grace Hanson typing. While we are waiting for what she is saying, I'd like to begin thanking you, Dr. Brown, for spending this time with us again. Unbelievable.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Unbelievable but true. 90 minutes has gone by since we started.
Goodness. That was quick.
So I'd like to thank all the colleges for joining us today, and thank you for the wonderful questions. If there are additional questions, feel free to email me, and I will get them to Dr. Brown. Dr. Brown will be in communication with me regarding some of the resources and tools we talked about today. And I should say to you that we're already beginning to have conversations about our continued work and additional coming events. So please stay tuned. And one last thing, it would be very helpful if you could participate in a very brief survey that I will be sending your way. We take every single thing that you say as being very important because you're at the colleges doing the work with our students, and so it would be good to get your feedback regarding today's webinar. And again, thank you, Dr. Brown, and thank you to the colleges who shared in this good presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll wait for a few minutes. For the most part, it seems like people are saying thank you, the presentation was amazing, it was helpful. I'm looking to see if but if there are any follow-up questions, I'll be sure to send those your way. And again, thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Goodbye.
Thanks very much, Will. Goodbye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.